There is an old saying among those who work the sea: the ocean keeps what it takes. When a steel ship slips beneath the waves, the manifest is closed, and the souls on board are transferred from the registry of the living to the silence of the deep. We are taught that survival has a time limit. We are taught that human beings cannot breathe underwater. But what happens when the ocean makes a mistake? On a calm morning in May 2013, a tugboat off the coast of Nigeria capsized and sank in seconds. 11 men were lost to the dark. But 30 meters down, trapped inside the twisted, inverted wreckage of the hull, one man was still awake. He wasn't a captain, he wasn't a diver, he was the cook. And for 60 hours, he sat in a pitch-black air pocket the size of a coffin, listening to the ocean destroy the world around him. This is not the headline you saw on the news. This is the untold reality of what happens when a man is forced to bargain with death. It is a story of physics, of terror, and of the unthinkable things we do to survive when the lights go out. So, turn off your phone. Settle into your chair. Join me as we descend into the wreck to uncover the forgotten story of the man who refused to become a ghost. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only at 4:30 in the morning on the open ocean. It is not a true absence of sound, but rather a rhythmic mechanical lullaby. It is the deep, chest-vibrating thrum of diesel engines turning massive shafts. It is the slap of water against a steel hull, a sound that never stops, never changes, and eventually becomes so constant that the human brain ceases to hear it at all. On the morning of May 26, 2013, the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nigeria was breathing slowly. The swell was moderate, the kind that rocks a vessel just enough to remind you that the ground beneath your feet is fluid, but not enough to spill a cup of coffee. The sky was still the bruised purple of pre-dawn, holding on to the night for just a few minutes longer before the relentless equatorial sun would burn through the haze. In this vast, shifting darkness sat a speck of light, the Jascon 4. She was a tugboat, an anchor-handling tug supply vessel to be precise. To the uninitiated, she looked like a floating fortress, squat, powerful, painted in industrial orange and white, cluttered with winches and cranes. She was a working beast, a machine built to wrestle with the giants of the oil industry. Her job was to haul oil tankers, position drilling rigs, and fight the sheer physics of the sea with horsepower and steel cables. Inside the belly of this beast, life was beginning to stir. While the deckhands and the engineers slept in their bunks, wrapped in the artificial cool of air conditioning, Harrison Okene was already awake. Harrison was the cook. In the hierarchy of offshore drilling, the cook is a ghost. He is the man who is everywhere and nowhere. He is the first to rise and the last to sleep. His domain is not the bridge, with its glowing radar screens and complex charts, nor is it the engine room, with its deafening pistons and smell of hot oil. His domain is the galley. It is a place of white tiles, stainless steel surfaces, and the smell of frying onions. On this particular morning, Harrison moved with the muscle memory of a man who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. He washed his hands. He checked the pilot lights on the massive industrial stoves. He began to crack eggs, the shells snapping with a crisp sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He was preparing breakfast for a crew of 12. 12 men who were currently dreaming, trusting that when they woke the world would be exactly as they left it. They trusted the ship. They trusted the captain. And, in a primal way, they trusted Harrison to have the coffee hot and the rice steaming. Harrison hummed to himself as he worked. He was a man of simple faith and simple duties. He did not know how to navigate by the stars. He did not know the complex mathematics of ballast and buoyancy. He knew that the ship was a steel bubble that kept the water out. As long as the engines hummed, he was safe. He was just a cook at sea, 11 years into a career that had taken him miles from the solid earth of Delta State, Nigeria, and suspended him over the abyss. But the abyss is patient. The ocean does not care about routines. It does not care about the smell of breakfast or the schedules of oil companies. It waits for a mistake. It waits for a moment of weakness in the machine. And on this morning, the mistake had already been made. It was not a dramatic explosion or a sudden storm. It was a subtle shift in weight, a silent conversation between gravity and buoyancy that was about to turn violent. The Jascon 4 was tethered to an oil tanker, performing a routine tension tow. This is a delicate dance where the tugboat pulls against a much larger vessel to keep it steady against the currents. It requires immense power and precise balance. The tug is essentially a frantic ant trying to hold back a drifting elephant. The cables groan under the tension. The engines scream. Up on the bridge, the mood was likely tense but controlled. But down in the galley, Harrison felt nothing but the usual vibration. He was worried about the eggs. He was thinking about his wife at home. He was thinking about the Sunday service he was missing. He stepped out of the galley and moved toward the bathroom. It was a small, unimportant decision. A shift of location by 20 feet. In the grand calculus of survival, those 20 feet would mean the difference between life and a watery grave. The ship lurched. It wasn't the usual roll of a wave. This was different. It felt like the floor had suddenly become slippery, like the steel plates themselves were trying to slide out from under his boots. Harrison stumbled, putting a hand out against the bulkhead to steady himself. He heard a sound from the galley, a crash of pots and pans sliding off the counters. He paused. His heart hammered a confused rhythm. The vibration of the engines changed pitch, deepening into a growl as the propellers bit into the water, trying to correct the angle. Then the world tilted. It didn't stop at 10 degrees. It didn't stop at 20. The ship groaned, a terrifying metallic scream of structural stress. It sounded like the vessel was in pain. The tilt continued, smooth and horrifyingly fast. Harrison was thrown against the wall. The door to the bathroom slammed shut, then swung open again, banging against the frame. The lights flickered. The hum of the ventilation system died, replaced by the roar of loose equipment crashing through the corridors. In the cabins, men who had been sleeping were thrown from their bunks. There was no time to wake up, no time to understand. They went from dreams to nightmare in the span of a heartbeat. The floor became the wall became the ceiling. Harrison scrambled, his hands clawing at the doorframe. He needed to get out. He needed to reach the muster station. That was the drill. That was what they were told to do. But drills are for calm seas and upright ships. Drills assume you can walk. The Jascon 4 was capsizing. The tension from the tow line, combined with the shifting waves and perhaps a rogue swell, had pulled the tugboat over its limit. The center of gravity, that invisible anchor that keeps a ship upright, had been lost. As the ship rolled past 90 degrees, the ocean rushed in. It didn't trickle, it smashed. Windows burst inward, unable to withstand the pressure of the sea. Doors were ripped from their hinges. The Atlantic Ocean, cold and dark and heavy, invaded the sanctuary of the ship. Harrison heard the water before he saw it. It sounded like a freight train roaring through a tunnel. He was in the bathroom, a small enclosed space near the galley. The ship was turning upside down. He was tumbling, bruising his shoulders and knees against the porcelain and steel. Then the lights died. Total, absolute darkness. The roar of the water consumed everything. Harrison screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. He felt the cold shock of the water hitting him. It was violent, churning with debris, chairs, books, tools, the shattered remnants of the life they had built on board. He was swept up, or was it down? In the dark, there is no up or down. There is only the water. He held his breath, his lungs burning, his mind blank with pure animal panic. He flailed, his hands striking solid objects, his body being battered by the currents swirling inside the sinking hull. The ship was diving. It was headed for the bottom, 30 meters down. Harrison was trapped inside a steel coffin that was plummeting toward the seabed. He swam. He didn't know where. He just fought the water. He kicked and clawed, driven by the singular imperative of every living thing: do not die. His head hit something hard, a ceiling, a floor. He pushed against it, desperate for air. The water was rising around him, filling his nose, stinging his eyes. He gasped, swallowing a mouthful of salty, oily water. He choked, coughed, and flailed again. And then, his face broke the surface. He gasped, a ragged, tearing sound in the dark. There was air. It wasn't fresh air. It was stale, and smelled of diesel and fear. But it was air. He was treading water in pitch blackness. He reached out and touched a wall. He reached up and touched pipes. He realized with a creeping horror that he was in a small pocket of trapped air. The ship had settled on the bottom of the ocean upside down. He was walking on the ceiling. The noise of the sinking had stopped. The screaming of the metal had ceased. The roar of the rushing water had faded to a terrifying gurgle. Harrison Okene was alive, but he was alone in the dark at the bottom of the sea. To understand the magnitude of this isolation, we must look at the machine that now held him prisoner. The Jascon 4 was not a small boat. She was over 30 meters long, built of thick steel plates welded together to withstand the punishment of the industrial ocean. She was designed to be a fortress against the elements, to keep the crew warm and dry while the Atlantic raged outside. But when a ship flips, its greatest strength becomes its greatest weapon against the crew. The watertight doors, designed to keep water out of individual compartments, now trapped water inside. The heavy steel bulkheads, designed to provide structural integrity, now blocked radio signals and screams. The complex labyrinth of corridors, so familiar during the day, became a three-dimensional maze of death in the dark. The offshore industry is built on a foundation of calculated risk. Every bolt, every weld, every procedure is analyzed for cost versus safety. Companies like the one that owned the Jascon 4 operate on thin margins. Time is money. A tugboat sitting in port is a hole in the balance sheet. A tugboat at sea is a profit center. This pressure creates a culture where the machine is pushed to its limits. Maintenance windows are squeezed. Inspections are hurried. The grand ambition of the industry is to tame the ocean, to extract its wealth without paying the price in blood. But the ocean always collects its debt. The Jascon 4 was an aging vessel. She had seen better days. There were rumors among the crew, whispers in the mess hall about ballast tanks that didn't fill evenly, about winches that stuck, about the list she developed when the fuel was low. These were the ghosts in the machine, the small mechanical flaws that men learn to live with. They became part of the ship's personality. She pulls to the left, they would say. She groans when the sea is high. Harrison knew none of this technical detail. He only knew the personality of the crew. He knew the captain liked his coffee black. He knew the chief engineer had a daughter he called every night. He knew the deckhands were tired. Now, floating in the dark, Harrison wondered where they were. He called out, "Hello?" His voice sounded strange. The air pressure at this depth, 30 meters down, was 4 times that of the surface. The air was dense. It vibrated differently in his throat. It made his voice sound high and thin, like a cartoon character. "Is anybody there?" Silence. The only answer was the lapping of water against the steel walls of his prison. He began to move. He had to know where he was. He was in his underwear. The water was cold, a chilling temperature that immediately began to leach the heat from his body. He reached out in the blackness, his fingers brushing against floating debris. A mattress, a wooden crate, a boot. He realized he was in a cabin. The layout of the ship was etched in his mind, but it was all wrong. The door was at the bottom of the wall. The ceiling was the floor. He had to mentally rotate the entire world 180 degrees to make sense of it. He found a ledge, an overturned desk or bunk, and pulled himself out of the water. He sat there, shivering, his teeth chattering so hard they ached. He was in an officer's cabin, he realized. But which one? He needed to find the others. He couldn't be the only one. There were 11 other men on board, experienced men, men who knew the sea. Surely they had escaped. Surely they were in another air pocket, or perhaps they had made it to the surface. He had to move. He slipped back into the water. It felt like stepping into liquid ice. He took a breath of the pressurized air and dove under the doorframe, swimming into the corridor. It was a nightmare of obstacles. The corridor was filled with floating debris, clothing, life jackets that had never been worn, boxes of supplies. He pushed through the flotsam, his hands searching for a familiar shape. He found a door. He pushed it open. He wasn't alone. In the next room, he heard the sound of breathing. Not the rhythmic, calm breathing of sleep, but the jagged, panicked gasps of men fighting for their lives. He called out again. 2 voices answered. They were his shipmates. They were alive. Harrison felt a surge of hope. He wasn't the only ghost in the wreck. He swam toward the voices. They were in another cabin, clinging to a mattress that was pressed against the ceiling, which was now the only dry place left. They huddled together in the dark. They touched each other to confirm they were real. They prayed, they cried, they spoke of rescue. "The divers will come," one of them said. "They have to come." "The company knows," said the other. "They are sending help." Harrison wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that the grand ambition of the oil industry included a plan for this. That there were teams of men in fast boats racing toward them right now. That the machine which had failed them was now the focus of a massive, sophisticated rescue operation. But as the hours passed, the water kept rising. The air pocket in their room was shrinking. The physics of the situation were ruthless. As the ship settled into the mud, or as waves passed overhead, the pressure fluctuated. The air they were breathing was being compressed. And with every breath they took, they were converting oxygen into carbon dioxide. They were in a race they couldn't see, against a clock they couldn't hear. The water lapped at their chins. They tilted their heads back, pressing their noses against the steel plates of the hull. They were trapped in the bilge of the world, breathing the last few inches of air. Then, the tragedy deepened. One of the men stopped talking. He slid quietly under the water. He didn't struggle. He just let go. The cold and the lack of oxygen had claimed him. Harrison reached for him, but he was gone. Then the second man began to panic. He started to thrash, screaming that he had to get out, that he could swim to the surface. It was a delusion born of hypoxia and terror. To swim out, he would have to dive down, navigate through the labyrinth of the upside-down ship in total darkness, find an exit, and then ascend 30 meters without exploding his lungs from the pressure change. "Don't go," Harrison begged him. "Stay here. Wait." But the man couldn't wait. He dove. Harrison heard the splash. He heard the frantic kicking. And then he heard the silence return. He was alone again. He was in a tomb that had just claimed 2 of his friends. The water in the cabin was too high now. He couldn't stay there. If he stayed, he would die just like them. He had to move. He had to find a bigger pocket of air. Harrison Okene, the cook who didn't know how to swim well, who didn't know the ship's schematics, who had no survival training, made a decision. He would not wait for the water to take him. He took a deep breath of the foul air, plunged into the black water, and swam back into the corridor. He was navigating by touch, by instinct, and by a desperate refusal to accept the end. He felt his way along the walls. He remembered a bathroom near the officer's cabin. Bathrooms were small, tile-lined, and they had high thresholds. Maybe, just maybe, it would hold air. He found the door. He wrestled it open against the pressure. He surfaced inside. It was a tiny space, a toilet enclosure adjoining a bedroom. But there was air. He pulled himself up onto an overturned wash basin. It was precarious. He was curled up in a ball, shivering violently, suspended in a pocket of air no larger than a coffin. But he was safe. For now. He sat there, and the reality of his situation began to settle upon him like the weight of the ocean itself. He was 30 meters underwater. He was inside a capsized ship. He had no food. He had no fresh water. He had no light. He was wearing only his underwear. The temperature of the water was roughly 20 degrees Celsius, cold enough to induce hypothermia over time, but warm enough that it wouldn't kill him instantly. It was a slow torture. He listened. He heard the creaking of the ship as it shifted in the mud. He heard the distant muffled thuds of heavy equipment rolling around on the seabed. He heard the terrifying sounds of fish eating, something nearby. He realized that the grand ambition was a lie. The ship was not a fortress. It was a cage. The industry was not a protector. It was a distant, uncaring entity that had already written him off. In the boardrooms on shore, they were likely already calculating the insurance payout. They were notifying the families. They were drafting the press releases. Tragic loss of life. All hands lost. Harrison Okene did not know it yet, but he was already a ghost to the world above. He had been declared dead. The search and rescue operation was transitioning into a recovery mission. They weren't coming to save him. They were coming to count the bodies. But Harrison was not a number. He was a man, and in the darkness of that inverted bathroom, he made a pact with himself. He would not just be a body to be recovered. He would breathe. He would wait. He would survive the machine. He wrapped his arms around his knees to conserve warmth. He closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the pitch black. He began to recite the psalms he had learned as a child. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The words were a comfort, a tether to the world of light and order. But even as he prayed, his body was beginning to betray him. The thirst was starting. The cold was gnawing at his bones. And the air, the precious limited air, was growing heavy with the poison of his own breath. This was the end of the normal world. This was the end of the morning routine, the smell of frying onions, the solid ground of the day-to-day. Harrison Okene had crossed a threshold that few humans ever cross and return from. He was a resident of the deep now, a tenant of the wreck, and the landlord was cruel. The first hour passed, then the second. Harrison sat in the dark and listened to the silence of the grave. He did not know that this was only the beginning. He did not know that he would have to endure this darkness not for hours but for days. He did not know that he would be forced to drink his own waste. He did not know that he would have to listen to the aquatic scavengers feeding on his friends. He simply knew that he was cold, and he was alone. The grand ambition of the Jascon 4 lay broken on the ocean floor. The ship, once a symbol of human engineering and dominance over nature, was now just debris, a metallic carcass rotting in the salt. But inside the carcass, a single heart was still beating, a small, stubborn rhythm against the crushing pressure of the sea. Harrison took another breath. He held it. He let it out slowly, one breath at a time. That was the only strategy left. And far above, on the sun-drenched surface of the Atlantic, the waves rolled on, indifferent, hiding their secret beneath a mask of blue. The world moved on. The sun climbed higher. Lunch was served on other ships. Life continued. But down in the dark, the long wait had begun. Darkness, when it is absolute, is not merely the absence of light. It is a physical weight. It presses against the eyes, demanding to be seen but offering nothing. In the deep ocean, inside a steel hull buried in the silt, the darkness is a solid thing. It has a texture. It feels thick, suffocating, and eternal. Harrison Okene sat inside this darkness, and he began to map the boundaries of his world. He was no longer in the Atlantic Ocean. He was no longer on a ship. He was in a box. By reaching out his hand, he could touch the limits of his existence. To his left, the slick, cold tiles of the bathroom wall. To his right, the jagged edge of a broken doorframe. Above him, the water, black and oily, a ceiling that was constantly threatening to fall. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a blind man. Every movement rippled the water, and every ripple sent a small, terrifying wave slapping against his chest. He had found a shelf, perhaps it was a cabinet or the underside of a sink, that was now acting as a platform. He huddled there, keeping his head in the highest point of the room. He began to explore the wreckage by touch alone. His fingers grazed floating objects, a toothbrush, a plastic cup, a boot. These were the artifacts of a civilization that had ended hours ago. They were useless now. The currency of this new world was not money or tools or rank. It was altitude. Inches meant life. If he could keep his nose 3 inches above the waterline, he existed. If he slipped, he became part of the debris. The ship was groaning. It was a massive, dying animal settling into its grave. The metal creaked as the currents pushed against the hull. Every pop and groan echoed through the water, amplified by the pressure, sounding like gunshots or slamming doors. Harrison would freeze at every sound, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the water to rush in and finish the job. But the water held its line. It had reached an equilibrium with the air pressure. This was the physics of the miracle, though it felt like a curse. The air trapped inside the tugboat was being compressed by the weight of the ocean above it. At 30 meters depth, the pressure is 4 atmospheres. That means the air Harrison was breathing was 4 times denser than the air at the surface. He didn't know the science, but he felt the effects. Every breath he took felt heavy. The air was thick, rich, and strange. When he spoke to himself, whispering prayers into the dark, his voice sounded nasal and high-pitched, like he had inhaled helium. It was the Donald Duck effect, a phenomenon well known to deep-sea divers, but to a terrified cook in the dark, It was just another sign that he had entered a realm where the laws of nature were broken. He was cold. The water was stripping the heat from his body layer by layer. He was wearing only his boxer shorts. He tried to construct a nest. He found a mattress floating in the adjoining cabin, and with a burst of desperate energy, managed to wrestle it onto a platform. He piled other debris on top of it, trying to create a dry island. He curled up on it, pulling a damp sheet around his shoulders. It was wet, but it trapped a thin layer of warmth. Time began to dissolve. In the world above, time is measured by the sun, by watches, by the rhythm of shifts. In the sunken ship, time was measured only by the beating of his heart and the rasp of his breath. There was no sunrise. There was no sunset. There was only the long stretching now. He slept in fitful, terrified bursts. He would drift off, exhausted, only to be jerked awake by a nightmare of falling or by the sound of water lapping too close to his ear. He would wake up gasping, flailing in the dark, needing to touch the wall to remind himself of where he was. And with every hour that passed, the chemistry of his prison was changing. He was not just running out of air, he was poisoning it. Every time he exhaled, he released carbon dioxide. In a sealed space, CO2 is a silent assassin. It is heavy. It sinks. It builds up from the waterline, creeping upward like an invisible flood. As the concentration rises, it begins to affect the mind. It causes confusion, lethargy, and a strange, narcotic euphoria. Harrison felt it. He felt a heaviness in his limbs that had nothing to do with fatigue. He felt a dull, pounding headache behind his eyes. He found himself staring into the blackness, his mind drifting to strange places. He thought about the eggs he had been cracking that morning. He wondered if they were still on the counter, floating in the dark. He thought about the text message his wife had sent him days ago. He realized, with a jolt of clarity, that he had to stay calm. Panic increases heart rate. A fast heart rate burns more oxygen. If he panicked, he would die faster. "Air is a loan," he whispered to the dark. "You have to pay it back." He forced himself to breathe slowly, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. He became a miser of oxygen. He was hoarding his own life, measuring it out in shallow sips. But while the air was a loan, the water was a thief. The thirst arrived not as a desire, but as a demand. It started as a dryness in the back of the throat. Then it became a sticky, paste-like sensation in the mouth. Then it became a burning, cracking pain. He was surrounded by water. It was everywhere. It lapped at his toes. It dripped from the ceiling. But it was salt water, and worse, it was polluted. The ship's fuel tanks had ruptured during the capsize. The water inside the hull was covered in a slick, iridescent film of diesel. The smell of it was overpowering. It filled the air pocket, coating the inside of Harrison's nose and throat. It tasted of chemicals and machinery. To drink the seawater would be suicide. The salt would dehydrate him further, accelerating the failure of his kidneys. The diesel would poison him, causing vomiting and aspiration that would likely drown him. He was a man stranded in a desert made of water. 10 hours passed, 12, 15. The thirst began to distort his thinking. He fantasized about a bottle of Fanta. He could see the condensation on the glass. He could feel the cold bubbles on his tongue. He thought about the rain barrels back home in his village, overflowing with sweet, clear water. His tongue felt too big for his mouth. His lips were cracking, splitting open from the salt air. He licked them and tasted the bitterness of the fuel. He needed fluid. His body was a machine that was running dry. Without water, the blood thickens. The heart has to work harder to pump sludge through the veins. The brain begins to shrink. The organs begin to shut down one by one. He knew what he had to do. He had heard stories. Every sailor knows the stories of men on life rafts drifting for weeks. He knew the desperate measures of survival. He needed to urinate. The urge was there, a dull pressure in his bladder. He hesitated. He was a civilized man. He was a man of dignity, a man who cooked for others, who kept a clean kitchen. There are lines that we draw to separate ourselves from animals. We do not eat raw flesh. We do not sleep in our own filth, and we do not drink our own waste. But the dark does not care about dignity. The dark only cares about survival. He found a plastic bottle floating in the debris. He uncapped it. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer psychological weight of what he was about to do. He filled the bottle. The liquid was warm. He held it in his hand for a long time. He sat in the absolute blackness, listening to the creaking of the ship, holding the warm plastic against his chest. He tried to rationalize it. "It is sterile," he told himself. "It is mostly water. It is medicine." He unscrewed the cap. The smell was sharp, ammoniac, distinct even over the stench of the diesel. He lifted it to his lips. His body rebelled. His throat closed up. His stomach churned in anticipation of the disgust. It was a violation of every instinct he had ever learned. "Please," he whispered. "Please." He tilted his head back and drank. It was warm and salty. It tasted of everything he was afraid of. He gagged, coughing, spluttering, almost vomiting it back up, but he forced himself to swallow. He forced it down. He sat there, gasping, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Tears streamed down his face, hot and salty, mixing with the seawater on his skin. He felt a deep, profound shame. He felt like he had lost something that he could never get back. He had crossed the line. He was no longer the cook. He was a creature of the wreck. But as the fluid hit his stomach, the cramps eased. The burning in his throat subsided slightly. He had bought himself time. He had traded his pride for a few more hours of life. "I will live," he said, and his voice was stronger now. "I will live." While Harrison drank from the cup of his own despair, the world above was operating on a different logic. The surface of the ocean was bright and busy. The news of the capsizing had traveled fast. "Tugboat lost, off Nigerian coast." It was a headline on maritime websites, a scrolling ticker on news channels. To the public, it was a tragedy, a sad event that would be forgotten by lunchtime. To the oil company and the salvage operators, it was a logistical problem. A dive support vessel had arrived on the scene. These are the heavy hitters of the offshore world, massive ships equipped with saturation diving systems, cranes and ROVs. They are floating cities of technology designed to work in the most hostile environment on Earth. But the mood on the dive support vessel was not one of urgency. It was one of somber professionalism. The golden hour of rescue, that critical window where survival is likely, had passed long ago. The Jascon 4 had been underwater for over 24 hours. The math was simple, and the math was cruel. A ship capsizes instantly. The crew is asleep. The water temperature is cold. The depth is 30 meters. The probability of anyone surviving the initial rollover, finding an air pocket, and surviving the pressure and the cold for a full day was statistically zero. The mission was classified as body recovery. Men in coveralls stood on the deck, looking at the sonar scans. They saw the ghostly outline of the tugboat lying on the seabed. They weren't looking for heat signatures. They weren't listening for tapping. They were planning how to cut into the hull to retrieve the dead. They were discussing how to bring the bodies up without traumatizing the divers. They were worrying about the stability of the wreck, about the currents, about the insurance liability. They did not know that 30 meters below their steel-toed boots, a man was reciting Psalm 23. They did not know that a heart was still beating in the tomb. The sensors saw only metal and mud. The technology, for all its sophistication, was blind to the miracle. Back in the dark, the miracle was fraying. Harrison was entering the second day, or was it the third? He couldn't tell. The cycles of sleep and waking had blurred into a continuous grey hallucination. The carbon dioxide was doing its work. The air pocket was a toxic soup. His mind began to detach from reality. He saw lights in the dark. Not real lights, but phantoms created by his starving optic nerves. He saw flashes of green and purple. He saw the face of his wife, floating in the water. She was smiling at him. "Come home," she seemed to say. "It's time for dinner." He reached out to touch her, but his hand passed through empty air and splashed into the cold water. "I'm here," he muttered. "I'm cooking the rice." He heard voices. The galley was full of men. He could hear the clatter of forks on plates. He could hear the laughter of the captain. He could smell the frying onions. It was so real. He just had to open the door and he would be back in the light. He just had to swim out. He stood up. He was ready to leave. The delusion was so strong it overpowered his survival instinct. He wanted to walk out of the bathroom. He wanted to swim down the corridor and join the men in the mess hall. He stepped into the water. It was up to his chest. "Wait," a voice said. Was it his own voice? Was it God? Was it the last firing synapse of a dying brain? "If you leave, you die." Harrison froze. The hallway was dark. There was no light. There was no smell of onions. There was only the cold, oily stench of the wreck. He realized he was hallucinating. He scrambled back onto his platform, shaking violently. He grabbed the mattress and pulled it over his head, hiding from the visions. He was losing his mind. The isolation was breaking him. He started to talk to himself loudly, aggressively. He needed to hear a real sound to banish the ghosts. "My name is Harrison Okene. I am a cook. I am from Nigeria. I am alive. I am alive." He repeated it like a mantra. He anchored himself to his identity with words. And then he heard something else. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't the creaking of the ship. It wasn't the water. It was a thud, clang. It came from outside the hull. It was distant, but distinct. It was the sound of metal on metal. Harrison stopped breathing. He lifted his head. Clang, clang. It was rhythmic. It was purposeful. It was the sound of a hammer. Someone was out there. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, flooded his system. He wasn't dead. He wasn't a ghost. There were men outside. He scrambled to the wall of the hull. He found a piece of metal, a pipe or a tool, and he began to hammer back. Bang, bang, bang. "I am here!" he screamed. "I am here!" His voice was a squeak in the pressurized air. He hammered until his arm burned. He hammered until the skin on his knuckles tore. He waited for a response. Silence. The hammering outside continued, but it didn't change rhythm. It moved away. It faded. They weren't signaling him. They were working. They were setting anchors. They were preparing to cut. They didn't hear him. Harrison dropped the metal pipe. He slumped back against the wall. The hope that had flared up so violently now collapsed into a despair deeper than before. They were right there, just a few inches of steel away. But they were in a different universe. They were in the world of the living, and he was sealed in the world of the dead. He realized then that he couldn't just wait to be found. He was small. The ship was huge. If they were coming for bodies, they wouldn't be looking for a man hiding in an air pocket in a bathroom. They would go to the cabins. They would go to the bridge. He was invisible. He had to survive not just the ocean, but the rescue itself. He curled up again. The cold was inside him now. His core temperature was dropping. He could feel his heart slowing down, conserving energy, preparing for the end. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He just drifted in the black void, suspended between hope and the crushing weight of the water. And then the sound changed. It wasn't a hammer anymore. It was a buzzing sound, a vibration that traveled through the steel floor and into his bones. It was a saw. They were cutting in. The tomb was being opened. But Harrison didn't know if they were letting the light in or if they were letting the rest of the ocean in. He didn't know if the sparks from a cutting torch would ignite the diesel fumes and incinerate him. He didn't know if the sudden change in pressure would burst his eardrums. He only knew that the silence was over. The machine had returned. He pulled his knees to his chest. He prepared himself. The act of faith was over. The act of endurance was ending. Now, the crisis began. The diver was coming. To enter the wreck of the Jascon 4 was to leave the planet Earth. The men who descended to the seabed were not swimming. They were operating. They were saturation divers, the astronauts of the inner space. They lived in a pressurized chamber on the surface ship, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen, their bodies saturated with gas to withstand the crushing weight of the deep. They were lowered in a diving bell, a steel elevator that dropped them into the abyss. When the bell doors opened at the bottom, they stepped out into a world of silt and shadow. They were tethered to the bell by an umbilical, a thick cable that provided them with breathing gas, hot water to keep their suits warm, and a voice linked to the surface. Without that cable, they were dead in seconds. The diver, Nico, moved toward the overturned hull. His breathing was a rhythmic hiss in his helmet, a sound that filled his entire skull. Hiss, click, hiss, click. His lights cut through the murky water, illuminating the rust and the barnacles that were already claiming the steel. He wasn't looking for survivors. That wasn't the brief. The brief was clear: locate the bodies, tag them, retrieve them if possible. It was a grim harvest. The mindset was forensic, detached. You don't expect a corpse to wave at you. You don't expect the dead to negotiate. Nico swam up into the wreck. Because the ship was upside down, he was entering through the bottom, which was now the top. He had to navigate a confused geometry of pipes and walkways that were inverted. Debris floated everywhere, a surreal suspension of everyday life. A boot, a book, a chair. The supervisor's voice crackled in his ear, a calm, godlike presence from the control room on the surface ship. "Watch your umbilical, Nico. Sharp edges on your left." "Copy," Nico said. His voice, too, was distorted by the helium, sounding high and cartoonish, but the discipline of the dive kept it serious. He moved deeper into the ship. He passed the cabins where the other crew members had been found. It was a silent, tragic scene. The water was still. The dead were drifting, peaceful in the gloom. He approached the area near the galley. The corridor was blocked by flotsam, mattresses, furniture, boxes. He pushed them aside, his gloved hands moving heavy objects with the slow-motion grace of the underwater world. He saw a hand. It was pale, visible in the beam of his headlamp, resting on a piece of debris. Nico paused. He reached out to grab it, to secure the body. This was the job. You take the hand, you pull, you guide the lost man home. He closed his gloved fingers around the wrist, and the hand squeezed back. It was a spasm of life so unexpected, so impossible, that it didn't register as reality. It felt like an electric shock. The hand didn't just squeeze, it grabbed, it clawed. Harrison, sitting in the dark, had seen the light. He had heard the bubbles. And when the alien hand of the diver touched him, he didn't wait. He unleashed the last reserve of his energy. Harrison grabbed the diver's hand. Nico shouted into his mask, "He's alive! He's alive!" The supervisor on the surface, staring at the video feed, saw the hand moving. "What? Say again, Nico? There's a survivor. He's holding my hand." The shock in the control room was absolute. Men who had spent decades in the offshore industry, men who had seen everything the ocean could do to a ship, froze. The protocols for body recovery were instant and practiced. The protocols for finding a living man after 3 days on the ocean floor did not exist. Back in the wreck, the dynamic had shifted violently. Nico pulled his hand back, startled, but Harrison wouldn't let go. He was terrified that if he let go, the angel would vanish. Nico shone his light into the air pocket, and there he was. Harrison Okene, naked, shivering violently, his eyes wide and white in the harsh glare of the dive light, his skin peeling from the salt water. He looked like a man who had returned from the dead because, for all practical purposes, he had. Harrison tried to speak, but he was weak. He gestured to his mouth. "Water," he croaked. "Water." Nico, recovering his composure, gave the thumbs-up signal. It was the universal diver sign for "I am okay," but in this context it meant, "I see you, I have you." Harrison gave the thumbs-up back, a gesture of infinite relief. The mood in the control room shifted from shock to frantic, high-stakes problem-solving. This was no longer a cleanup, it was a rescue, and it was a rescue with a ticking clock. "Get him water," the supervisor ordered. "Get him assurance, but do not repeat, do not bring him out yet. It seems cruel. You find a man in hell and you tell him to wait." But physics is a tyrant. Harrison had been under pressure for 60 hours. His body was saturated with nitrogen. If they pulled him straight to the surface, the nitrogen in his blood would bubble out like a shaken soda bottle. He would die of the bends before he even broke the surface. He was trapped by the very pressure that had kept the water at bay. Nico surfaced into the air pocket. He looked like a monster from a sci-fi movie, a massive helmet, a thick suit, hoses trailing behind him. He removed his glove and reached out a human hand. He touched Harrison's shoulder. "I'm going to get you out," Nico said. His helium voice was squeaky, just like Harrison's. It was a surreal conversation between two men who sounded like cartoons, but were discussing matters of life and death. Harrison nodded. He didn't care about the voice. He cared about the touch. It was the first human contact he had had in 3 days. It was warm. Nico produced a bottle of water. Harrison drank it in one go, crushing the plastic in his desperate grip. "Slow down," Nico said. "Slow down." Then the logistics began. They couldn't just swim him to the bell. The water was freezing. Harrison was hypothermic. His heart was fragile. The shock of the cold water during the swim back could stop it. Nico rigged up a helmet for him. It wasn't a sleek diving mask. It was a heavy, industrial piece of equipment called a band mask. It sealed around the face. It had a communications line. "You have to breathe," Nico told him. "Just breathe." They strapped the helmet onto Harrison's head. It was heavy. It smelled of rubber and other men's breath. Harrison panicked. He was claustrophobic. He had been trapped in a box for days, and now they were putting his head in a smaller box. "I can't!" Harrison cried. "I can't!" "You have to," Nico said, firm but gentle. "It's the only way home." Harrison closed his eyes. He thought of the darkness he had endured. He thought of the silence. He thought of the urine he had drunk. He had come too far to die because he was afraid of a mask. He nodded. "Okay." They sealed the mask. The hiss of gas filled his ears. Oxygen, sweet, clean oxygen. "Can you hear me?" The supervisor's voice cut through the static, directly into Harrison's ear. "Yes," Harrison said. "We are bringing you home, son. You're doing great." Nico checked the gauges. He checked the umbilical. He wrapped a harness around Harrison's waist. He was tethering Harrison to himself. They were now one unit. "We are going into the water now," Nico said. This was the hardest part. Harrison had to leave the safety of his air pocket, the dry coffin that had saved him, and submerge himself back into the black water that had killed his friends. He slid off the platform. The cold hit him like a hammer, even through the adrenaline, but this time he wasn't alone. Nico held him. Nico guided him. They swam through the inverted corridors. Harrison kept his eyes closed. He didn't want to see the bodies of his shipmates. He didn't want to see the ruins of the ship. He just felt the tug of the harness and the reassuring grip of the diver's hand. They reached the exit, the hole in the hull where the divers had entered. They swam out into the open ocean. For a moment, Harrison was suspended in the abyss. Above him he could see the faint lights of the diving bell. It looked like a spaceship hovering in the dark. They swam toward it. The journey was short, perhaps only 50 meters, but it felt like miles. Every kick was a battle against exhaustion. They reached the bell. The bottom hatch was open, a circle of light. Nico pushed Harrison up. Harrison broke the surface inside the bell. It was dry, it was bright. There was another diver there waiting to pull him in. They stripped off the mask. They wrapped him in blankets. They poured warm water over him to bring his temperature up. Harrison slumped against the curved wall of the diving bell. He was shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the divers, these men in their rubber suits, these strangers who had descended into the grave to find him. "Thank you," he whispered, but he wasn't safe yet. The diving bell was still at the pressure of the seabed. They couldn't just open the door when they reached the surface. The bell ascended. It was a slow ride. The winch whined, pulling them up through the water column. Harrison felt the movement. He felt the ship getting closer. When the bell locked onto the surface ship's system, there was a metallic clunk. But the door didn't open to the fresh air. It opened into a decompression chamber. Harrison was transferred from the bell to the chamber. It was a long steel tube lined with bunks. It looked like a submarine. He was out of the ocean, but he was still in a prison. He had to undergo decompression. The nitrogen in his tissues had to be released slowly. If they rushed it, the bubbles would tear his joints apart, cause strokes, kill him instantly. The protocol for saturation decompression is slow, painfully slow. For the depth he had been at and the duration of his stay, he would need to stay in that chamber for another 2.5 days. 2.5 days. He lay on the bunk. The divers gave him food, hot soup, bread. He ate like a starving wolf. They gave him water. They gave him a phone to call his wife. When he heard her voice, the dam broke. He didn't say anything at first. He just wept. He wept for the terror. He wept for the relief. He wept for the men who weren't in the chamber with him. "I'm alive," he choked out. "I'm alive." Outside the chamber, the world was reacting. The story was breaking. The miracle cook. The man who survived 3 days underwater. The media wanted photos. The company wanted statements. But inside the chamber, it was quiet. The air was still thick and warm. The hiss of the gas system was the only sound. Harrison lay back on the narrow bunk. He looked at the steel ceiling. It was just a few feet above his face. It reminded him of the air pocket. It reminded him of the bathroom. He closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. Every time he drifted off, he felt the water rising. He felt the cold. He heard the groaning of the dying ship. He was safe. The doctors said his vitals were stable. The supervisor said he was a legend. The divers treated him with a gentle reverence, like he was a holy relic they had retrieved from a temple. But Harrison knew the truth. He hadn't conquered the ocean. He hadn't outsmarted the machine. He had simply been ignored by death. He was a clerical error in the Book of the Dead. And as the pressure in the chamber slowly, hour by hour, bled away to match the surface world, Harrison Okene waited. He was waiting to step out of the steel box and breathe air that didn't taste of helium and fear. He was waiting to see the sky. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that a part of him would never leave the Jascon 4. A part of him was still sitting on that overturned basin in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for the water to take him. The decompression chamber was a limbo, a station between the underworld and the living, and Harrison sat there, a man caught between two deaths, wondering what kind of life would be waiting for him when the door finally cracked open. The hiss of the decompression chamber unsealing is a sound that marks the border between two worlds. For 60 hours inside the steel tube, the pressure had been slowly, meticulously bled away. The nitrogen, which had dissolved into Harrison Okene's blood like sugar in hot tea, had been coaxed out, bubble by microscopic bubble. When the heavy circular door finally swung open, the air that rushed in did not smell like the ocean. It smelled of grease, of ozone, of the sweat of living men. It was the air of the surface world. It was thin. It lacked the crushing weight he had grown used to. To Harrison it felt insubstantial, as if he might float away into the sky if he didn't hold onto the railing. He stepped out. His legs were weak, his muscles atrophied from days of confinement in the dark, curled in a fetal ball. The light of the deck was blinding. Even the grey, overcast sky of the Atlantic felt like a physical assault on his retinas. He squinted, shielding his eyes, a man born a second time, emerging from the womb of the machine. But a resurrection is not a triumph. It is a dislocation. As he stood on the deck of the rescue vessel, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by cheering crewmen and flashing cameras, Harrison looked around. He scanned the faces of the divers, the engineers, the support staff. He was looking for the others. He was looking for the captain. He was looking for the 3 other men he had heard breathing in the dark before the silence took them. He asked the question that had been burning in his throat for days. Where are the others? The cheering dampened. The smiles on the faces of the rescue team faltered, then stiffened into the professional mask of tragedy. Someone, perhaps a supervisor or a medic, placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a heavy hand. "Harrison," they said, "you are the only one." The words did not make sense. 11 other men, 11 fathers, brothers, sons, men he had shared breakfast with. Men he had joked with about football scores and salary delays. The ship was huge. There were so many rooms, so many pockets of air. "No," he said. "The others, in the cabin." They didn't make it, Harrison. The statistical probability had corrected itself. The ocean had taken its due. Harrison Okene was not the first survivor, he was the sole survivor. The anomaly, the glitch in the death toll. In that moment, the joy of survival evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hollow sensation in the pit of his stomach that was heavier than the ocean itself. It is a specific kind of guilt, sharp and enduring, to be the one who walked away. Why him? Why the cook? He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the smartest. He wasn't the highest ranking. He hadn't swum the best or held his breath the longest. He had simply been in the bathroom. The geography of his survival came down to architecture. The Jascon 4 had sunk stern first, turning over as it went. The design of the ship meant that the lower decks, where the cabins were, flooded instantly. But the area near the galley where the bathroom was located had become the highest point of the inverted wreck. It was a bubble of geometry, a fluke of engineering. If he had been in the mess hall, he would be dead. If he had been in his bunk, he would be dead. If he had opened the door 2 seconds earlier or 2 seconds later, he would be dead. He was alive because of a 4-foot square of air and a decision to go use the toilet at 4:30 in the morning. The news of his survival broke across the world like a wave. The miracle man, the survivor of the abyss. The photos of him sitting in the decompression chamber, looking exhausted and bewildered, were plastered across newspapers from Lagos to London. The video of the moment the diver found him, that sudden, terrifying hand grab, became a viral sensation. The world loves a miracle. It devours them. A miracle confirms that there is hope, that the universe is not entirely indifferent, that prayer works, that humans are resilient. People watched the footage on their smartphones while riding the subway or sitting in comfortable offices, and they felt a shiver of vicarious thrill. They shared the link. They commented, "Amazing" and "God is great." But they did not smell the diesel. They did not taste the urine. They did not feel the skin peeling off their bodies from the salt water. Harrison was flown back to land. He was taken to a hospital. He was poked and prodded by doctors who were fascinated by his physiology. They measured his lung capacity. They checked his blood for nitrogen bubbles. They treated the sores on his skin. He became a specimen, the science of the impossible. Experts weighed in on talk shows. They explained Boyle's law. They explained that as the ship sank, the air inside was compressed, creating a high-pressure environment that saturated Harrison's tissues with nitrogen. They explained that this pressure actually helped keep him alive by increasing the partial pressure of oxygen, allowing him to survive on stale air for longer than he could have at the surface. They calculated that the air pocket was roughly 4 feet high, just enough to sustain one man for 60 hours, but not two. They turned his suffering into math. They sanitized the horror with equations, but Harrison was not doing math, he was trying to sleep, and he couldn't. The first night in a real bed, in a hotel room paid for by the oil company, he turned off the lights. Immediately the room began to spin. The silence of the hotel was not peaceful, it was threatening. It was the silence of the tomb. He felt the mattress sinking. He felt the walls closing in. He gasped for air, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned the lights back on. He sat up. He stared at the dry carpet, the dry walls, the dry ceiling. He realized then that the ocean had not let him go. It had followed him home. This is the legacy of the wreck. It is not a story that ends with the credits rolling as the hero walks into the sunset. It is a story that continues in the quiet, broken moments of a life that has been permanently altered. PTSD is a clinical term. It stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. But for Harrison, it was a visceral, physical haunting. It was the inability to take a shower because the spray of water on his face felt like drowning. It was the panic attack in the back seat of a car because the windows were rolled up. It was the nightmare that came every time he closed his eyes, the sensation of falling, the cold, the hand of the dead man in the cabin next to him. He attended the funerals of his shipmates. This was the price of his survival. He had to stand there, the living proof of the miracle, while 11 families lowered empty coffins or body bags into the ground. He had to look into the eyes of the widows and the children. They didn't say it, but he could hear the question in their weeping. Why you? Why not my husband? Why not my father? He felt like a thief. He felt like he had stolen the air that belonged to them. The company, the owners of the Jascon 4, moved quickly to settle the affairs. This is how the machine works. Tragedy is a liability. It must be quantified, paid for, and filed away. Settlements were offered. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. The narrative was controlled. The investigation into the sinking was technical and dry. It cited poor weather conditions, tension in the tow line, and human error. It noted the age of the vessel. It noted the maintenance logs. It distributed blame in small, manageable percentages so that no single entity had to carry the full weight of the disaster. The Jascon 4 itself was left on the bottom of the ocean. It would have been too expensive to raise her. She was stripped of her value, her fuel pumped out to prevent pollution, her sensitive equipment removed by ROVs. Then she was abandoned. She sits there still, 30 meters down, a steel skeleton rusting in the dark. The barnacles have claimed her. The fish swim through the galley where Harrison used to fry onions. The currents sweep through the cabin where the men died. She is a monument to the grand ambition, a tomb for 11 men, and the birthplace of one survivor. Harrison tried to return to normal life. He went back to his wife. He went back to his church. He tried to be the man he was before May 26, 2013, but the water is patient. He found he could not go back to sea. The very smell of the ocean, the salt tang that used to signal work and money and routine, now triggered a nausea that shook him to his core. He, a man who had made his living on the water for over a decade, was now exiled to the land. He lost his livelihood. The skills of a ship's cook are not easily transferable to a city restaurant. The rhythm is different, the isolation is different. And the employers? They looked at him with a mix of pity and superstition. He was the man who came back. Was he lucky, or was he cursed? He struggled. The money from the interviews dried up. The settlement was finite. The world moved on to the next disaster, the next miracle, the next viral video. Harrison Okene was left alone with his memories. He remembers the darkness most of all. Not the visual darkness, but the acoustic darkness, the way the groans of the ship sounded like voices, the way his own breath sounded like an intruder. He remembers the moment of the urine, that specific, degrading act of survival. He thinks about it often. It is the anchor point of his trauma. It was the moment he realized that civilization is a thin veneer. Strip away the light, strip away the safety, strip away the water, and we are all just biological engines desperate to keep running. He wonders if he would do it again. And the answer, which terrifies him, is yes. He would do anything to live. That is the hard truth that he carries. The survival instinct is not noble. It is not heroic. It is ferocious and ugly and necessary. Years have passed now. Harrison is older. The scars on his skin have faded, blending into the lines of age. He has found new work on land, far from the roar of the surf. He cooks for people who sleep in beds that do not move. But sometimes, when the rain is heavy against the window, or when the power goes out and the room plunges into sudden blackness, he is back there. He is sitting on the overturned wash basin. He is shivering in his underwear. He is holding the plastic bottle. He is waiting for the diver who might never come. The story of Harrison Okene is often told as a story of divine intervention, a miracle. And perhaps it was. To survive against such staggering odds requires the alignment of variables so precise that it feels like the hand of God. But if you strip away the mysticism, if you look at the raw mechanics of the event, you are left with something more haunting. You are left with a man who was put in a coffin by the negligence of an industry that prioritized profit over safety. A man who was kept alive by the indifferent laws of physics. A man who had to consume his own waste to buy a few more hours of existence. It is a story about the fragility of the systems we trust. We trust the ship to float. We trust the engine to run. We trust the company to care. We trust that if we do our jobs, we will go home. But the ocean does not sign contracts. The ocean does not follow safety protocols. Harrison Okene is a living witness to the fact that when the machine breaks, when the lights go out, we are all just soft, breathing things in a hard, sharp world. In the end, what does it cost to stay alive? It costs you your ignorance. You can never again believe that you are safe. You can never again look at a glass of water without measuring its value. You can never again sleep without listening for the sound of the world tipping over. Harrison walks down the street in Lagos. The sun is hot. The dust is thick. The noise of the traffic is deafening. Life is loud and bright and chaotic. He stops at a vendor to buy a bottle of water. He pays the few naira. He holds the cold plastic in his hand. He cracks the seal. Click. He drinks. It is sweet. It is cold. It is pure. He closes his eyes, and for a second, he is not on the street. He is floating. Then he opens his eyes. He exhales. He puts the cap back on. He is alive, and for now that has to be enough.